São Paulo, 1998. A conference room at Banco Noroeste. 3 auditors from Santander are holding a single sheet of paper. $242 million is missing. Not stolen in the traditional sense, it simply does not exist where it should. The wire transfers are real. The signatures are real. The government seals are real. But the airport, the one they have been funding for 3 years, it was never real. Someone convinced an entire bank that paperwork was worth $250 million. And the man who did it never fired a gun, never cracked a safe, never wrote a line of code. He just understood that at the highest levels of international finance, trust is the only currency that matters. Let's rewind to 1995. Lagos, Nigeria. A former bank executive in a tailored suit picks up the phone. He is about to pull off one of history's most audacious cons. Emmanuel Nwude was not a hacker. He was a former director at Union Bank of Nigeria with insider knowledge of how international finance actually worked. He understood that banks do not verify every government document. They verify the first one, and then they trust the process. The plan was audacious. Pose as Paul Ogwuma, the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, and sell a partnership opportunity to build a new international airport in Abuja. The target was not random. Nelson Sakaguchi, director of Banco Noroeste's international division, had a reputation for aggressive deal-making in emerging markets. Nwude did not send a mass email. He sent a personalized letter on forged central bank letterhead, complete with official seals and reference numbers. The letter promised exclusivity. The Brazilian bank would finance the construction. In return, they would receive a percentage of the airport's future revenue and a cut of a separate oil deal. Sakaguchi took the bait, not because he was naive, but because the offer was structured like a legitimate sovereign infrastructure project. Think about it. You are a director at a major bank. You receive a letter from a central bank governor offering exclusive access to a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure deal. The letterhead is perfect. The seals match government records. The language is formal, bureaucratic. Exactly what you would expect. You do not immediately assume it is fake. You assume it is an opportunity. That is the trap. Nwude was not selling an airport. He was selling legitimacy. He knew that banks like Banco Noroeste were hunting for high-yield deals in developing markets. He knew they were willing to take risks if the paperwork looked right. And he knew that once Sakaguchi started the process, the psychology of commitment would do the rest. The first meeting was not over email. It was face-to-face. When Sakaguchi flew to Nigeria to verify the deal, Nwude arranged meetings in actual government buildings, using accomplices posing as ministry officials. The governor's office was real. The security guards were real. The paperwork looked identical to legitimate central bank contracts. Sakaguchi was not sitting in a back alley warehouse. He was sitting in a conference room with marble floors and portraits of past governors on the walls. Nwude played the role perfectly, calm, authoritative, slightly impatient. The way a central banker would behave when dealing with foreign investors. He even introduced Sakaguchi to a man posing as the Minister of Aviation, who confirmed the airport project and added urgency. The psychological trap was set. Sakaguchi had flown across the Atlantic, met government officials, and seen the blueprints. Walking away now would mean admitting he had wasted the bank's time and money. The first wire transfer was $10 million, a deposit to secure the partnership. Then another $15 million for licensing fees. Then $30 million for construction delays. Over 3 years, the transfers kept coming, each one justified by a new bureaucratic hurdle, a new ministry approval, a new final payment before the project could move forward. Nwude was not just stealing money, he was conducting an orchestra. Every delay, every complication, every request for more funds was timed perfectly to keep Sakaguchi believing the airport was just one payment away from breaking ground. By 1997, Banco Noroeste had sent $242 million, and the airport still did not exist. But Nwude was not worried. He had built something more powerful than an airport. He had built a performance that felt more real than reality itself. The thing is, most cons collapse because the illusion cracks. A forged signature does not match. A phone number traces back to a burner. A meeting location raises suspicion. Nwude eliminated those cracks. He did not just forge documents. He staged an entire production with real locations, real props, and real actors who believed they were part of a legitimate deal. Every time Sakaguchi requested verification, Nwude provided it, not with excuses, but with more evidence. When Sakaguchi asked for updated construction photos, Nwude sent images of actual construction sites in Abuja, not the airport, of course, just generic infrastructure projects that could pass as early-stage development. When Sakaguchi requested meetings with additional officials, Nwude arranged them. More accomplices, more conference rooms, more government seals stamped on more documents. The operation required precision. Nwude had to know which questions Sakaguchi would ask before he asked them. He had to anticipate doubts and preemptively address them with layers of manufactured credibility. This was not improvisation, it was choreography. And Sakaguchi kept wiring money because every verification he performed confirmed what he already believed. The airport was real. The delays were normal. The investment would pay off. Here is where it gets complicated. Sakaguchi was not stupid. He was experienced and operating within a bank that had compliance procedures specifically designed to prevent fraud. But Nwude understood something fundamental about institutional psychology. Once a bank commits to a deal, the internal pressure to see it through becomes overwhelming. Sakaguchi had already authorized over $100 million in transfers by late 1996. If he admitted the project was fraudulent, it would not just destroy his career. It would trigger investigations, lawsuits, and potentially criminal charges for negligence. So he kept believing. Because the alternative was personal ruin, Nwude fed that belief with just enough progress reports to justify the next payment. Each update was vague enough to avoid specifics, but detailed enough to sound legitimate. And every time Sakaguchi hesitated, Nwude applied pressure. Other investors are interested. The government needs a decision. If you pull out now, you lose everything you have already invested. This is the psychology of the long con. The victim becomes an accomplice because walking away means admitting they were fooled. By mid-1997, the operation had been sustained for nearly 3 years. Nwude was living like royalty. Luxury properties in London, Johannesburg, and Lagos, a private jet, parties at 5-star hotels. He was not hiding, he was celebrating, because he had done something most con artists only dream about. He had convinced a major international bank that paperwork alone was worth $250 million. The machinery was still running, the documents were still flowing, the money was still moving. But Nwude had made one miscalculation. He assumed the performance could run forever, that as long as he kept feeding Sakaguchi updates, the money would keep flowing. He did not account for the one thing that destroys every illusion: outside scrutiny. The operation was about to collide with reality. In 1997, Santander, one of Spain's largest banks, announced plans to acquire Banco Noroeste. Standard procedure required a full audit of the Brazilian bank's assets and liabilities. The auditors arrived in São Paulo with spreadsheets, compliance checklists, and a mandate to verify every major transaction from the past 5 years. They found something strange in the Cayman Islands branch. A series of wire transfers totaling $242 million, all sent to the same recipient in Nigeria. The documentation looked legitimate: government seals, ministry approvals, signed contracts for an airport construction project in Abuja. But auditors are trained to verify, not trust. They contacted the Central Bank of Nigeria directly, not through the contact information provided in the contracts, through official channels listed in international banking directories. Paul Oguma, the real governor, had never authorized any partnership with Banco Noroeste. The contracts were forgeries. The meetings had been staged. The airport did not exist. The auditors pulled the thread. Every document was cross-referenced. Every signature was analyzed. Every meeting location was verified. The central bank confirmed they had never issued the letterhead. The construction photos were traced back to unrelated infrastructure sites across Nigeria. The entire operation unraveled in a matter of weeks. Santander immediately halted the acquisition. Banco Noroeste's stock instantly collapsed. Internal investigations revealed that Sakaguchi had bypassed multiple compliance checks, authorized transfers without proper verification, and ignored red flags that should have triggered fraud alerts. The bank's board of directors faced a nightmare scenario. They had lost $242 million to a con so sophisticated it had fooled their international division for 3 years. Sakaguchi was fired immediately. He later faced criminal charges in Brazil for negligence and possible complicity. The question was not just how he had been deceived, but whether he had known and continued anyway, because admitting the fraud would destroy him. The Brazilian authorities launched a criminal investigation. Interpol was notified. The Economic and Financial Crimes Commission in Nigeria was pressured to act, but Nwude was already moving. He knew the audit would eventually happen. He knew that once Santander's team started digging, the illusion would collapse. So he had already begun dispersing the money through shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate business investments that could obscure the source of the funds. The money flowed through the Cayman Islands, then to accounts in Switzerland, then back to Nigeria through a network of front companies. Forensic accountants traced millions to luxury real estate purchases in London and Johannesburg. They found evidence of investments in legitimate Nigerian businesses. They discovered accounts in the names of relatives and associates who claimed no knowledge of the fraud. But the bulk of the money? It vanished. The thing is, recovering stolen funds across international borders is nearly impossible. Each country has different laws, different cooperation agreements, different levels of enforcement. Brazil could freeze assets in Brazil. Switzerland could freeze assets in Switzerland. But coordinating a global asset seizure requires years of legal proceedings, extradition treaties, and a mutual cooperation between governments that often have competing interests. Nwude understood this. He had designed the laundering operation to exploit jurisdictional gaps. By the time the investigations reached Nigeria, the money had been converted, reinvested, and hidden so thoroughly that even identifying which accounts belonged to Nwude became a legal battle. The audit had exposed the con. But catching the man who orchestrated it would take years, and by then, the damage was done. Banco Noroeste would be liquidated in 2001, wiped out by a single fraudulent deal that destroyed shareholder value, ended careers, and proved that even major international banks could be fooled by perfectly executed paperwork. The question was not whether Nwude would be caught, it was whether the money could ever be recovered. For nearly 2 years after the discovery, Nwude remained untouchable. He was not hiding in a remote village or using a fake identity. He was living openly in Lagos, attending social events, conducting business, and moving through the city like a man who had nothing to fear. And in many ways, he didn't. Nigerian law enforcement at the time was underfunded, overwhelmed, and dealing with far more immediate crimes than a fraud case involving a Brazilian bank. International cooperation was slow. Extradition treaties were complicated. But the real reason Nwude remained untouchable was simpler. He had bought the system. Not just influence, not just connections. He had systematically corrupted the people who could have stopped him. High-ranking police officials received payments to ensure investigations moved slowly or disappeared entirely. Legal figures were compensated to create procedural delays. Government officials who could have expedited extradition requests were kept quiet with cash and threats. Nwude understood that in a system where law enforcement salaries were low and corruption was endemic, $242 million bought more than luxury. It bought immunity. When Brazilian authorities pushed for his arrest, their requests sat on desks for months. When Interpol issued alerts, local police claimed they could not locate him, even though he was living openly in one of Lagos's wealthiest neighborhoods. And as long as the money kept flowing to the right people, he could live freely, while international investigators raged from thousands of miles away. Brazilian authorities worked with Interpol to track the funds, but the trail went cold in the Cayman Islands, then resurfaced in South Africa, then vanished again into a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. Every time investigators thought they had located a significant asset, it had already been moved, sold, or transferred to a third party with no apparent connection to Nwude. The frustration was immense. Everyone knew who had orchestrated the fraud. They knew where he lived, but proving it in a way that would hold up in multiple international courts was a different problem entirely. Then, in 2004, something shifted. Nigeria was under international pressure to crack down on over 400 fraud schemes. The scams had become so widespread that the country's reputation was suffering. Foreign banks were refusing to do business with Nigerian institutions. Investors were pulling out. The government needed a high-profile win, and Nwude was the perfect target. Nigerian authorities finally arrested him as part of a broader crackdown, designed to signal that the country was serious about combating financial crime. The arrest was not quiet. It was publicized, politicized, and framed as a victory for law enforcement. The trial revealed the full scope of the operation. Nwude had worked with at least 5 accomplices, including a lawyer who forged the government documents and a former aviation official who posed as the Minister of Aviation during Sakaguchi's visits. The prosecution presented evidence of forged letterheads, staged meetings, and a meticulously planned deception that had lasted nearly 3 years. Nwude's defense argued that he had been a middleman, not the mastermind, that he had been manipulated by others, that the real criminals had fled the country. But the court didn't buy it. In 2005, Nwude was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was also ordered to pay $10 million in restitution to Banco Noroest's creditors. But here is the reality. Most of the $242 million was never recovered. Forensic accountants traced some of it. They found luxury properties, business investments, and accounts in the names of relatives. But the bulk of the money had been laundered, spent, or hidden so thoroughly that even the most aggressive asset recovery efforts came up empty. Brazil recovered less than 10% of what was stolen, and in Nwude, he served only a fraction of his sentence before being released on health grounds in 2006. He died in 2013, reportedly still wealthy, still living in Lagos, still untouchable in the ways that mattered. The legal system had caught him, but the money, it was gone. Subscribe and comment below what you do with the money.